Well, good morning, team, and welcome to another episode of Survival Nomad. I'm going to take you on a ride today, and together we're going to experience a very special birthday. More to follow. The key topic of today's video is why the KLR 650 is the best designed motorcycle on the face of the earth. So before we begin, let's go ahead and do some more riding. Now, this particular bike is a 1999 model that I bought in 2001, and it's been through quite a lot. Mostly it's been through a lot of my lack of maintenance, some crashes, and a complete inability to ride at times. Now let's talk about what's great about it first. It's very simple. It's got one cylinder, it's got one spark plug, and it's got one carburetor. So it's fairly easy to figure out what's wrong with it if something behaves poorly. If it doesn't start, you only have a limited number of things to diagnose. And it's easy to see if it has any electrical continuity problems with any of the parts using a simple, cheap multimeter. It's very simple. It's water cooled. Now, a lot of people will say that that's a disadvantage because of the added weight and complexity of having a water and cylinders with coolant running through it, and I would agree to a limited extent. However, let me pause at this moment for a moment to reflect on my very first motorcycle. I had a 1982 Yamaha Seika 550 that was air-cooled, and that bike on long trips would be awesome as long as you kept doing the speed limit. But the moment you were stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic, as you often do on a mountain highway like I-17 from Santa Cruz down into San Jose, you will smell oil burning on that motorcycle. It gets overheated very quickly, and that is plain not fun. So the KLR was the first water-cooled motorcycle I ever owned. It has never overheated. The fan kicks on when it starts getting too warm, and the water temperature has never gone beyond about the midway point in the gauge. So beyond simplicity, it's also very durable and very much under-stressed. And the bike is basically everything you need on it and none of the things you don't. For example, the instrument cluster is sparse compared to today's standards. It's difficult to even call it a cluster because it really only tells you speed, RPM, engine temperature, and a high beam, turn signal, and neutral indicator. There is no fuel gauge, so that you better know your range of your bike and make sure that the trip meter is hit every time you fuel up, so you can make sure that you're not caught behind the power curve on a long trip. I get over 50 miles per gallon, so with its 6.1 gallon tank, you're good for about 300 miles. I've noticed a slight decline in mileage with the lower 14-tooth sprocket that I put on it a little while ago compared to stock. I know a lot of people have made statements that the KLR doesn't get but 200-mile range on its tank, and maybe that's true on hard dirt trails. But for me, on pavement, at the speed limit, and as a commuter bike, I typically get at least 55 miles to the gallon. In terms of maintenance, an easy reminder is to run until you have to fill the tank and then lube the chain. Do those two things and your motorcycle will stay fairly easily running for the lifetime of the bike. Now, some people will also make comments that the bike goes on empty within 200 miles, and they'll make claims it only has a 5-gallon tank. Well, this is a Gen 1 Kawasaki KLR 650. And I have been able to fill this thing up to 6.1 gallons. The key thing to understand is this bike has a petcock on the left side of the tank. And maybe those who claim only a 200-mile range haven't realized that you need to turn the petcock to one of its three positions. Either turn the fuel off in case you have to remove the tank, turn it on, or go to reserve. So once you have it in the most downward position, that's on. If your bike starts stuttering at about 250 miles, it's time to go ahead and flick the switch forward and that will give you an extra gallon of gas to continue on with your journey. Now, a little history on this particular bike. I bought it in 2001 in Indianapolis, Indiana. The original owner was an older gentleman, surprisingly not so far from where I am today in terms of age and maybe girth. But the bike had been fairly simply modified. He'd owned it for about a year, and he had modified the airbox by cutting some holes in it to allow more air. He had changed out the air filter to a K&N rechargeable air filter, which I still use today. And he also added the KLX mod, or the 2-cent mod, which is basically putting two small washers on the needle jet to allow the gas to flow a little bit easier into the float. I think he put it in because he also purchased a Super Trap muffler. But even with those mods, the bike ran fantastic and gave me about 50 miles to the gallon. The original owner had replaced the foam seat with a Corbin seat. Now, the good thing about the seat is it lowers the rider height a little bit. Now, I'm 5'9", so it lets me sit flat-footed a little bit easier. He also included the original Kawasaki foam seat, and for the longest time, I never even put that seat on because I thought the Corbin seat was the thing to have. Unfortunately, it also actually weighed more, and I finally ended up swapping back out to the original seat. My 60-something rear end was far more comfortable on that thick foam seat than it was on the hard Corbin. Outside of oil changes and filter changes, the first major addition was to upgrade the front forks to progressive springs. The front fork was a little undersprung when ridden quickly in the twisties. Now, as I started getting into the bike a little more and reading through some of the forums, there was a lot of concern about replacing the doohickey, or the chain tensioner. I needed to change out the chain at one point, and at that time I knew it would be a good opportunity to change out the sprockets to a 16-tooth sprocket, as well as do the doohickey mod, which I did. The addition of the change to a 16-tooth, I noticed that the RPMs were about 500 RPMs lower than the standard stock sprocket. So I also ran a little bit quieter at speed. Once when I was riding a little bit faster for the cold and wet conditions in Columbus, Ohio, I ended up scraping the right turn signal, windshield, and body parts. This gave me the opportunity to get a slightly taller windshield for wind protection and the initiative to remove all the plastic body parts because it's no fun letting everybody know that you were a poor rider and that you had just gotten into an accident. Actually, I really liked the new rat biker look, and it also made maintenance a snap to get at all the bits and pieces for oil changes, air filter, and battery. One thing I will say is that the turn signals on the KLR are one of its weak points, and that they tend to get dry rotted riding out in the sun for long. So I've replaced all four of the turn signals in the front and back during the course of ownership. The front ones primarily because of the crash, and the rear ones because when I added a new rear pannier rack from Happy Trails. That model requires you to change out the rear turn signals and also move the elements or the helmet lock to a different location. The Kawasaki has a lot of great things going for it. Purchase price back in 2001 was not that significant and far less than buying a new one. But since I've owned it for so many years, it's paid for itself a number of times over in the savings on gas and mental therapy. The KLR truly is a strategic choice. They haven't changed the model much over its 35 some odd years of production. And by the time I purchased it in 2001, it had 15 years of production prior to me buying it. So parts availability and the aftermarket options were very much abundant. Things like changing out the turn signals or finding a pannier rack for the bike or the windshield were all a snap to find because they were readily available through numerous manufacturers. Kawasaki was genius in not changing the model much. Unlike some other motorcycles, high-end motorcycles like KTM or BMW, Kawasaki refrained from chasing the latest and greatest in engine, suspension, and electronics. While newer bikes may perform moderately better, They do so at the risk of repairability and ease of maintenance. 30 years of reliability, unhindered by progress, buys a lot of loyalty when you're looking for a cheap, repairable bike. Now, tongue-in-cheek, the KLR anti-lock braking system was engineered into the smallish front disc and the spongy rubber hoses used on the bike. It really needed help and was greatly improved with Galfer braided brake lines. More modern bikes have improved over time, no doubt. But if you're a cheap bastard like I am, the KLR allowed you to make the modifications as parts required replacement to meet newfound desires. No bike is perfect from the factory, even the much lauded BMW GS, but I can get about 90% of its real-world performance at a small portion of the price. One of my more time-consuming modifications for the bike was making some homemade aluminum panniers from 2 Army Mermite containers that were gutted from the inside, weather sealed with some school bus window molding, painted and then drilled for use on the Happy Trails rack. While they may not be the prettiest aluminum panniers on the market, they certainly cost me hundreds of dollars less than the high-speed, low-drag models that you can get from TourTech. One of the biggest lessons in the process was that if you do a cost-benefit analysis, the KLR will outperform just about anything else on the market. Something else that I think is a good philosophical consideration about owning any motorcycle is, are you serving the bike or is it serving you? Many folks simply must have the latest and greatest bike, but cannot change the oil or do simple maintenance like valve adjustments or tire changes. Their constant polishing and washing is more akin to idolatry than motorcycle ownership. And they spend perhaps a bit more time in worship of their motorcycle than actually enjoying the motorcycle to increase their enjoyment of life. Once you get over the first drop of your brand new bike, you can get on with the enjoyment of your riding experience. Unlike the KLR, which can effectively be serviced with a Leatherman tool, zip ties, and a cheap Harbor Freight multimeter, today's modern miracle has so many engine, suspension, and other computer sensors that a check engine light mandates a time-consuming and worrisome trip to the dealer at substantial potential cost. The simplicity of the KLR puts you in charge of the patient's recovery, both in price of parts and labor and time. God help you if your brand new BMW GMS has a check engine light, because then you're going to have to take it to a dealer or find somebody who has a high-speed computer to plug it into that ODB sensor to tell you what the problem might be. With the KLR, you can track the actual wires that go from front to back very easily. One highly recommended modification to any bike, in my opinion, is the addition of a sticker on the ignition to help keep you grounded. Not electrically, but spiritually. Above my ignition is a typed block letter 27X that reminds me every time I turn the key that I am 27 times more likely to die in a motor vehicle accident compared to my fellow motorists. A simple reminder that every time I ride, I am willing to take my life in my own hands, and that is my choice to take that risk for the enjoyment of riding. For whatever reason, knock on wood, I've only had one flat while I was actually riding, and that particular flat was a tire pressure issue with the tube rather than an actual cut or puncture of the tube or tire. Recently, I've learned to take off both tires and replace tubes and tires, and I've learned to repair the tubes. Where I've had problems is in replacing the tubes without resulting in a pinch flat. And so I've learned how to do that. One of the modifications I also do to the KLR was I changed out the rear wheel to a homemade tubeless setup using silicone and 3M industrial tape. I can now fix a rear puncture using a plug kit instead of having to take the entire tire off the bike. I do carry a 21-inch tube underneath the seat of the bike so that I can replace the front or rear to get me back on the road. I have all the tools in my toolkit on the bike to both inflate and change out tire and tube. Do not be afraid of the carburetor. On this motorcycle, it's very simple to take out and work on. And that is probably the most problematic issue that I created since I've owned the bike, when I allowed it to sit for about 4 years without draining the fuel. Thankfully, it did not do any damage to the tank itself, but ended up creating some varnish inside the carburetor jets and on the float bowl. That kept it in a stuck position where it would not run. I had always refrained from carb work because I had always thought of a carburetor jetting as a voodoo science. So another beautiful thing about the carburetor is that for a few dollars you can get a carburetor rebuild kit. As it turned out, all my parts were fine. I basically ended up cleaning them off with diesel fuel and then taking a very small wire to the varnish that had baked itself into one of the tubes inside the carb. After that, it was cleaned out and the bike ran phenomenally. I think that's one of the other things to be aware of as you're riding. Learning how to jet a carburetor is a great skill to have. It's very, very simple. All I need to carry with me in my toolkit now is a small screwdriver to get at the pilot jet, and I can even make the adjustments myself. The beauty of understanding your bike is that when things start going wrong with it, for example, you notice a huge change in your fuel mileage, going from 55 miles per gallon to 37, you know there's something wrong. Now, as a skilled pseudo-mechanic, you are more capable to help other motorcyclists with simple challenges on the road. Your roadworthiness is greatly enhanced, and you are more self-reliant. A true survival nomad. This is the KLR 650. There are many like it, but this one is my own. Now, all is not gravy with the KLR. It does have some minor challenges. The bike is a bit buzzy above 4,000 RPM, which equates to an indicated 60 miles per hour. Above that, the mirrors blur and the vibrations become a little bit annoying. While the bike is capable of 95 miles per hour, don't ask me how I know, that is if you tuck behind the windscreen, but it does not like it much. Keep her at 70 and below, and she'll appreciate it. Keep her below 60, and she might even not use any oil in 3,000 miles. Passing at freeway speed is challenging, as is the wind buffeting from semi-trucks. It can take you anywhere you want to go, just not as comfortably as something more purposefully built. Mine started burning oil at about 60,000 miles, but it takes less than a liter in 2,000 miles. It's got the original cylinder, piston rings, as well as all of the original bearings. Probably the next big maintenance item for me after 71,000 miles will be to look at changing the swing arm, wheel, and steering head bearings within the next 10,000 miles. The only one that really concerns me right now is the steering head bearing, because occasionally it feels a little bit notchy. I may be looking at moving up to an Eagle Mike 685 kit, which will add additional large piston, redo the head, valve seats, and have the cylinder honed out to 685. And then from all reports, I should eliminate all of the issues with burning oil. It has taken me 80,000 miles by then, and I will feel very confident that it will be good to go for another 80,000 miles. So yeah, the KLR is the most cost-effective, sustainable motorcycle ever invented. Good job, Kawasaki.
Okay. Well, congratulations. Happy birthday, KLR. You just got 71,000 miles on you. And we're going to do a little bit of a review walk around here. Couple things that you can see on this particular bike. I've got a tube on the back of the bike that looks kind of like about the same diameter as the exhaust. It's a tool tube. It basically has a lot of the original Kawasaki tools that came with it. I've got some more in here, and I've got basically a little netting in here. So if for whatever reason I've got something I absolutely have to take off and put on the back, I can. I had an incident with the bike a couple of months ago where it was the strangest thing. I don't think it would ever happen in a million years, but both of the bolts retaining the rear caliper here came off, and the rear caliper just popped off as I was riding actually around this same area, and got hit the spokes, did some damage as you can see, but this is the same caliper. Ended up zip tying it and drove real cautious with it. Came home, found a couple of bolts that actually are the same bolts that will fit in the disc calipers that I replaced. The front caliper I replaced a couple of years ago. Also did a little bit of damage to a couple of the spokes. Again, this is the rear tire that has the tubeless wheel in it. So I'm a little concerned about that. If I was going to keep this long term, which I think I am, I'm going to end up replacing that over time. Let's see. This is the airbox mod that I talked about that the original owner had done with the K&N filter. You can kind of see it through there a little bit. It's been, an easy thing. If I had done a lot of off-road riding prior to owning this thing, or prior to recently, I probably would have ended up leaving the cover back on it to protect the air, because I understand a lot of dirt can get in there and really mess with the bike. But for 71,000 miles, not too bad. I'll keep it. Coolant, I've had to change the original Kawasaki Green out. I think I've done 2 coolant changes since I've had the bike over the long period of time I've had it. Change out the springs. I told you about that. Had to replace these. I actually like these modded. The original color of this bike, if you can see here, is sort of a bluish tan. It was really a nice color, but after a couple of dings with it, I've ended up recoloring it. My daughter, when she was in school, was really into a character called Bumblebee, is a Transformer movie. So I ended up painting it yellow for her a long time ago. But she's well grown by now and probably doesn't appreciate that as much as I do back in the day. I think I changed out the bulb to a little bit brighter, and that might have, in retrospect, been a reason that I'm kind of using up a lot of electricity, and the battery discharge is a little bit faster than normal. I have changed out went to a Galfer stainless steel line. It works absolutely fine. But again, a big improvement. I actually like not having the radiator plastics covering the bike. I'll give you that it's probably a little bit more susceptible to damage. And then if there's any place that I fall, most of my falls have been on my left side for whatever reason. I've actually had to change out some of the parts in here around the fan and kind of bend them back into shape after a fall. But it seals, no leakages. Did have at one point, and I still don't know what the cause of it was, but I ended up having to replace the impeller inside the water pump. It ended up leaking fluid, but after that's been replaced, the bike's been, hasn't failed to cool. In fact, the whole time we've been riding today, we still haven't gotten above the midpoint in the temperature gauge, so it's definitely understressed. Let's see. What else can I tell you? Oh, I have had to replace the shift lever. Again, that's from not the fall you saw, but another fall. Ended up tweaking the original to the point where I absolutely needed to get a replacement. IMS makes some good stuff for Kawasaki's or KLRs and most dirt bikes. You can see the pegs are original. Heard some complaints that these end up falling off. Have not had that problem. It's convenient too, because when the bike does fall, they fold up and they don't stand out there and end up poking into your leg or keeping you impaled into something that you don't want to be impaled on. Had an incident, one of my maintenance blunders. After I fixed the carburetor on the bike, after I finished fixing the carburetor on the bike, as you can see, the chain protector, or the chain guard, is kind of cracked, and that happened when I was riding the bike after I hadn't done maintenance in a long time, and I'm talking years in that regard. The bike just sat. Chain got a little bit rusted. Ended up snapping on me, and not because I was going so fast. I think it was just the grit got in there between some of the teeth, or some of the pins in the chain, and ended up just whirring around one of the pins, and it came loose, and I lost the chain. But as it did lose the chain, it ended up breaking that piece of plastic. So that was the one time that she left me stranded. But again, that was well over 60,000 miles, trouble free. Batteries, you got to replace them every 3 years ish. I've heard good things about lithium. I'm just not going to pay for that. On the topic of philosophies of use,